If you're studying A-level philosophy and ethics or religious studies, subscribe. I am covering the entire course on this channel. Now, we've spent the last several videos building up a detailed picture of utilitarian ethics, and we've looked at Bentham's Hedonic Calculus, Mill's distinction between higher and lower pleasures, the difference between act and rule, and the general strengths and weaknesses of the theory. Now we arrive at what I think is the most powerful and philosophically serious challenge utilitarianism faces. It's not a technical quibble, a minor objection here. This is a challenge that strikes at the very heart of whether utilitarianism can be considered a complete moral theory at all. And that challenge is the justice problem. And the question we're going to sit with throughout this lecture is deceptively simple. Can a theory built entirely on the pursuit of happiness ever truly deliver justice? By the end of this video, you will be able to answer that question with real philosophical depth, and more importantly, you will know how to deploy that answer in A-level essays for the likes of OCR, AQA, and Edexcel. So, what is the justice problem? Well, let's begin with this core tension. Utilitarianism instructs us to maximize overall happiness, and that is the foundation of the entire theory. Everything follows from that principle. But here's the problem. What if maximizing overall happiness requires treating a specific individual unjustly? Now, what if the calculation, the cold, impartial mathematical calculation tells you that the right thing to do is to harm an innocent person, violate someone's rights, or sacrifice one person for the benefit of many? This is what philosophers call the justice problem, and it's not a hypothetical worry dreamed up in an armchair. It follows logically from the structure of the theory itself. If the greatest happiness for the greatest number is your only moral compass, then the interest of a minority group or even a single person can always in principle be overridden when the numbers are large enough. And here is why that matters for your essays. Justice, as most people understand it, is not just about outcomes. It involves the idea that certain things should not be done to people regardless of the consequences, and that individuals have rights which cannot simply be traded away for aggregate benefit. Now, if utility can override those rights, then the utilitarianism that we are looking at may be fundamentally incompatible with justice as we ordinarily understand it. And so we face what's called the tyranny of the majority. We need to make this concrete. The best philosophers, they don't just describe problems, but they will force you to feel the problem. So I want you to think about two cases, and I want you to be honest about your reaction to each one. Let's look at the Scapegoat Case. Imagine a town where serious riots are about to break out, and the local officer knows that unless someone is arrested and publicly punished, the violence will kill many people. And so he also knows that the man he is about to frame is completely innocent. Now, the utilitarian calculation appears straightforward. Many lives saved versus one innocent man imprisoned. The greatest happiness for the greatest number seems to endorse this frame-up. But something feels deeply wrong, and that feeling is philosophically important. Let's look at the Organ Transplant Case. A surgeon has 5 patients dying from organ failure. Each one needs a different organ. A healthy patient comes in for a routine checkup. The surgeon calculates that harvesting this one person's organs could save 5 lives. Again, the utilitarian arithmetic seems to favour it. 5 lives saved, 1 lost. Net gain of 4 lives. And yet virtually everyone will recoil from this conclusion. And here is a crucial piece of exam technique that you should write down now. These thought experiments, they're not just stories. They're examples of a formal philosophical technique called a reductio ad absurdum. You may have heard this from the ontological argument in the philosophy of religion. The argument works a bit like this. If a theory leads logically to a conclusion that is obviously morally monstrous, then something must be wrong with the theory. The conclusion is so unacceptable that it reflects back and undermines the premises that produced it. Name this technique in your essays. Examiners in all of these exam boards will reward you if you can show how your understanding of philosophical arguments work, not just what philosophers have said. The Scapegoat, the Organ Transplant Cases, they don't just illustrate the justice problem. They expose what the philosopher Bernard Williams called the structural tendency of utilitarianism, when the interests of the many consistently override the rights of the few. Injustice is not an accident. It is the outcome that the theory demands. So who are the key scholars on the justice problem? Three scholars are particularly important here, and I want to give you a real sense of what each of them was arguing, rather than just a name and a quote. So let's start with John L. Mackie. He argued that utilitarianism fundamentally fails to protect individual rights because it treats people as what he called receptacles for utility. In other words, what matters to the utilitarian is not the person, it is the happiness or the person contains. People become vessels, containers, and if you can get more happiness by redistributing it through the different containers, by sacrificing one person for many, the theory tells you to do it. Mackie thought that this was a fatal error because it misunderstands what persons actually are. You may be familiar with Mackie from The Problem of Evil. And if you're studying the Edexcel course, I have an entire video dedicated to analysing the set text anthology source. Another scholar is Bernard Williams, who I've already mentioned. He developed one of the most penetrating critiques in 20th century ethics. He introduced the concept of moral integrity. Williams argued that utilitarianism doesn't just ask you to do difficult things, it asks you to become a different kind of person. It demands that you be willing to set aside your deepest moral commitments, your most fundamental sense of who you are and what you stand for, whenever the calculation requires it. Williams called this alienation. Utilitarianism alienates you from your own integrity, and he thought that this was not just psychologically damaging, but philosophically incoherent. We also have Robert Nozick, who approached this from a libertarian direction. In his landmark work, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, he argued that individuals have rights which function as what he called side constraints. They are not factors to be weighed in a calculation. They are inviolable limits. You cannot violate someone's rights, even if doing so would produce enormous social benefit. People, he insisted, are ends in themselves, not resources to be redistributed for the sake of social unity. Three very different thinkers, but all arriving at the same essential verdict, that utilitarianism gets persons wrong. So, can rule utilitarianism solve this? And at this point, you might be thinking, surely rule utilitarianism just deals with all of these problems. After all, we could have a rule that says, do not frame innocent people, or do not harvest organs from healthy patients. And if those rules maximize happiness in the long run, then rule utilitarianism endorses them. And this is a reasonable response, and you should acknowledge it in essays before demolishing it, because it faces two devastating objections. The first is the rule worship objection, which is associated with the philosopher J.J.C. Smart and also pressed by Bernard Williams. It goes like this. Suppose you were in a specific situation where breaking the rule would clearly produce better consequences. A rule utilitarianism says you must follow the rule anyway. But why? If the whole point of the rule is to produce happiness and breaking it would produce more happiness in this particular case, then following the rule is irrational. And Smart called this rule worship. A bit like a fetish for rules that have no real utilitarian justification. And the second objection is what philosophers call the collapse problem. If rule utilitarians keep refining their rules to handle every possible exception, adding qualifications, special cases, sub-clauses, the rules eventually become so specific that they collapse back into act utilitarianism. And at that point, you're just evaluating individual actions again. And the justice problem returns with full force. So rule utilitarianism is not really a solution to the justice problem. It could be argued that it simply delays it. Well, one of the most elegant philosophical thought experiments of the 20th century was developed by the American philosopher John Rawls, and it was designed in part as a direct response to utilitarianism. Now, Rawls asks a brilliant question. How would you design a just society if you had no idea who you would be in that society? He called this the veil of ignorance. Imagine you're about to enter society, but you do not know your race, your gender, your wealth, your intelligence, or your social position. You might be the person whose organs are harvested. You might be the innocent person framed by the local police. You might be in the minority whose happiness is sacrificed for the majority. And Rawls argued that behind this veil of ignorance, rational people would never endorse a system that allowed the few to be sacrificed by the many, because you might just be one of the few. And this is a profound challenge to utilitarianism. It shows that justice cannot be determined by outcomes alone. Fairness must be a foundational principle, not a byproduct of utility calculations that might or might not happen to produce it. And for your essays, Rawls is a powerful counter-theory rather than just a critic. He shows what a justice-centered ethics looks like. Deploying him well means not just saying Rawls disagrees with utilitarianism, but explaining why his framework is philosophically more robust when it comes to protecting individuals. Well, we should connect this to other ethical theories. And this is where this lecture series pays off in essay terms, because the justice problem is not just a weakness of utilitarianism. It's the key that unlocks the entire ethics course that you're studying. Think about why Immanuel Kant developed his ethical theory in the first place. Kant's categorical imperative, and specifically the formula of humanity, acts so that if you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in any other, always as an end and never merely as a means, this is a precise philosophical response to exactly the kind of cases that we've been discussing. Harvesting a patient's organs uses that person merely as a means to save other people. Framing an innocent man uses him merely as a means to prevent riots. Kant says these actions are categorically prohibited, not because of their consequences, but because of what they are. They violate the fundamental dignity of persons. And this is why deontological constraints matter. They protect individuals regardless of what the numbers say. And natural law theory arrives at a similar conclusion through a different route. Thomas Aquinas held that different acts are intrinsically wrong. They violate the primary precepts that are built into human nature by God. Killing an innocent person violates the primary precept of the preservation of life. No utility calculation can override that. The absolute character of natural law is precisely what makes it a robust alternative to consequentialist reasoning. And here is the evaluative move that will take your essay to the highest band. Kant and natural law are not just critiques of utilitarianism, they're alternative answers to the question that utilitarianism gets wrong. Show the examiner that you understand this. The justice problem reveals what is missing from utilitarian ethics, and Kant and Aquinas supply it. And that's the kind of synoptic thinking of which the higher level bands of AO2 look like in all of the 3 exam boards. So how should you structure your essay? Again, I've said this before, exam boards don't provide a blueprint for how to write your essays. And that's because different teachers will teach it in different schools in different ways. But it's always good to have an idea and reflect on what would be a good structure to help you with the ingredients that you need. So let's turn everything we have covered into a high band essay. And the structure I'm recommending, it's not, as I've said, a mechanical formula, but it is a philosophical argument that unfolds in 4 movements. So first, you need to state the problem clearly. Define the justice problem in your own words. Establish the core tension between maximising utility and protecting individual rights. Use the term reductio ad absurdum if you are introducing a thought experiment. Secondly, deploy the thought experiments. Introduce the Scapegoat Case or the Organ Transplant Case. Explain what they reveal about the structure of utilitarian reasoning. Reference Williams, Nozick, and Mackey to show that these are not just your objections, they are serious scholarly challenges. Third, evaluate utilitarianism's response. Acknowledge rule utilitarianism fairly. It attempts to address the problem. Then explain why it fails, using the rule worship objection and the collapse problem. Show that you understand the debate from both sides. And fourth, compare with alternative frameworks. Bring in Kant or natural law, not as an afterthought, but as your conclusion. The point is not just that utilitarianism fails, it's that other theories succeed where utilitarianism fails. And so you should end with a clear evaluative judgment of your own. A strong essay uses the justice problem as a sustained philosophical argument, a lens through which the entire question is examined, rather than simply listing it as one weakness among many. And so there is key terminology across all of the exam boards. Let's consolidate the vocabulary. Every one of these terms should appear naturally in your essays, not dropped in artificially, but deployed at the right moment. The justice problem, the tension between maximising utility and protecting individual rights. The theory may demand outcomes that most people recognise as unjust. The tyranny of the majority, the structural tendency within utilitarian systems to sacrifice the interests of minorities when the numbers favour the majority. Integrity. Bernard Williams' term here for the deep moral identity that utilitarianism asks us to violate when it demands we act against our fundamental commitments. Side constraints. Nozick's term for individual rights. They are not variables in a calculation. They are inviolable limits on what may be done to a person. The veil of ignorance. Rawls's device for identifying principles of justice. Behind it, we do not know our place in society, so we design principles we would accept from any position. Reductio ad absurdum. A philosophical technique in which a theory is shown to be false because it leads logically to an obviously unacceptable conclusion. Learn these, use them. They are the difference between a student who knows the content and a student who thinks philosophically. So finally, let's just look at the kinds of questions exam boards typically ask so you can see where this fits in. The OCR exam board will ask questions like utilitarianism fails to uphold justice. Discuss. And critically assess the view that rule utilitarianism avoids the weaknesses of act utilitarianism. Both of these require you to deploy the justice problem as a central argument, not just a footnote. AQA asks students to assess the claim that utilitarianism cannot account for individual rights, and to compare the utilitarian and Kantian approaches to justice. That second question there is precisely what our previous slide prepares you for. And Edexcel. To what extent does utilitarianism provide an adequate basis for moral decision-making? And evaluate the justice problem as a challenge to utilitarian ethics. The second question is essentially an invitation to deliver this entire session in an essay. And one final piece of advice that applies to all of these exam boards. The justice problem is the most powerful one when it is used comparatively. Don't just show that utilitarianism fails. Show what a better account of justice looks like, and that is what transforms a competent essay into an outstanding one.